Grandpa never did anything important. He's just like an old guy who fixes stuff around the house. That was the sentence that changed everything. Not said with cruelty, just my grandson's voice, matter of fact and a little dismissive, explaining to his friends at a birthday party why he didn't have any interesting stories to share about his grandfather, the way some of his classmates apparently did about theirs. 2 weeks later, his history teacher stood at the front of a classroom of 30 freshmen, held up a photograph of a Silver Star citation projected on the screen behind her, and said, "This medal belongs to a man named Douglas Pierce, and I actually looked into it further this week because I discovered something remarkable. He's still alive, still lives right here in this town. Does anyone in this room happen to share that last name? My name is Douglas Pierce. I'm 76 years old, and I want to tell you the whole story, not just the ending, because I think the middle matters more than people expect it to. Welcome to Silent Honor, where we tell true stories about the quiet strength it takes to be underestimated by the people who need you most, and still choose to show up for them anyway. If you've ever had your life story dismissed by someone who simply never asked the right questions, this story is for you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight, and hit subscribe, because you're going to want to see exactly what happened in that classroom. Let me start where this really begins. I spent 26 years in the Army, the last 14 as a master sergeant leading soldiers through training and 2 combat deployments that shaped, more than anything else in my life, the man I eventually became. My wife Ruth passed 6 years ago, and since then, I've lived alone in a modest house at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, spending my days on small home repair projects for myself and occasionally for neighbors, keeping busy with the particular unhurried rhythm of a man who spent decades under considerable pressure and has genuinely earned a quieter chapter. My son Marcus has 1 child, my grandson Tyler, 14 years old now, a freshman at the local high school. I want to be honest that my relationship with Tyler has always been warm but somewhat surface level. The particular dynamic of a grandfather who genuinely loves his grandson but has never quite found the right moment, or perhaps never quite made the deliberate effort to share the fuller shape of his own life history with him. Here's the thing about me that Tyler grew up mostly not understanding, even though the evidence of it sat quietly in a small wooden box in my closet his entire life. During my second deployment, in circumstances I still don't discuss easily even now, I led a small element of soldiers through an ambush that resulted in significant casualties on the other side, while getting every one of my own men out alive, an action that earned me a Silver Star, a decoration I've discussed with almost nobody outside a small circle of men who were there with me. When Marcus was young, Ruth and I made a deliberate decision. We didn't want him growing up measuring himself against an old citation, treating me like some kind of legend instead of just his father. I wanted him to know me as the man who taught him to fix a leaking faucet, who showed up to his Little League games, who cried without shame at his wedding. So the wooden box stayed mostly closed, and we simply didn't discuss that part of my life very often, a habit that continued, without much deliberate thought, right into how Marcus eventually raised Tyler. I want to be careful here, because I don't think Tyler is a disrespectful kid. He's 14, at an age where social comparison among friends matters enormously, and I think, simply enough, he'd never been given any reason to think of me as anything other than the quiet grandfather who fixed things and showed up to family dinners without much fanfare. There was a school event about a year ago, a career day where students were encouraged to invite family members to speak about their professions, and Tyler chose to invite Marcus, who works in insurance, rather than me. A choice that made complete sense given how little Tyler actually understood about what my own career had involved, beyond a vague sense that I'd been in the Army a long time ago. There was a family dinner several months later when Tyler mentioned that a classmate's grandfather had been a well-known local doctor, describing the classmate's evident pride in sharing that fact with the class, and I noticed, without saying anything, a small flicker of something like envy in Tyler's expression, the particular feeling of a kid wishing he had a similarly impressive story to share about his own family. The specific comment that set everything in motion happened at a friend's birthday party, which I only learned about secondhand, through Marcus, who'd heard about it from another parent. Apparently, several of the boys at the party had been comparing notes about their grandparents, one describing a grandfather who'd been a successful business owner, another describing a grandmother who'd been a nurse during a significant historical period, and when it came to Tyler's turn, he'd shrugged and said, "Grandpa never did anything important. He's just like an old guy who fixes stuff around the house." I want to be honest about what I felt hearing that secondhand account from Marcus, sitting in my own kitchen, absorbing a description of my entire life that reduced 26 years of service, including circumstances I've spent decades trying to carry quietly rather than perform for anyone, down to fixing stuff around the house. I didn't say anything to Tyler directly about it. I told myself, the way people in my position often do, that he was young, that he genuinely had no way of knowing the fuller shape of my history, and that correcting a 14-year-old's careless comment at a birthday party wasn't worth the discomfort it would create. Let me pause the story right here for just a second, because I want to ask you something. Watching at home right now, have you ever had your entire life's significance reduced to something small and unremarkable by someone who simply never had the information to know otherwise? How did you carry that dismissal, knowing there was a fuller story underneath that nobody had thought to ask about? Tell me in the comments, because I read every single one, and if this story is already feeling familiar, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because what happened 2 weeks later is the part of this story you really don't want to miss. 2 weeks after that birthday party, on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, I got a call from Marcus, his voice carrying an unusual excitement he didn't fully explain until I'd sat down properly. "Dad," he said, "Tyler's history teacher called the house. She wants to talk to you directly, if you're willing." Apparently something happened in class today that's got the whole freshman history department talking. I want to describe what had actually happened in that classroom, because Marcus relayed it to me in considerable detail after speaking with the teacher himself, and I think the specifics matter enormously to understanding everything that followed. Tyler's history teacher, a woman named Ms. Patricia Alvarez, had been teaching a unit on modern military history, and as part of that unit, she'd selected several notable, lesser-known citation stories to discuss with the class. Cases she'd researched specifically because they illustrated decision-making under genuinely difficult circumstances rather than simply presenting famous, oft-repeated stories. One of those citations, drawn from a regional veterans archive she'd been researching for her own curriculum development, belonged to a Silver Star recipient named Douglas Pierce. Partway through presenting that citation to the class, projecting a photograph of the actual medal, and reading portions of the official commendation, Miss Alvarez had, out of simple curiosity, mentioned to the class that her research suggested this particular Douglas Pierce still lived locally, an unusual enough detail that she'd decided to share it, mostly as an interesting aside about history existing closer to home than students often assume. "Does anyone in this room happen to share that last name?" she'd asked, according to Marcus's account, not expecting any particular response, simply making conversation. Tyler, sitting near the back of the classroom, had gone very still, according to what a classmate later told Marcus, slowly raising his hand with an expression the classmate described as somewhere between confusion and disbelief. That's my grandfather," Tyler had said. "Douglas Pierce. He lives like 15 minutes from here." Ms. Alvarez, according to Marcus, had been genuinely stunned, the classroom apparently going completely silent as she processed the coincidence, before asking Tyler a series of increasingly excited questions about whether this was truly the same man, whether Tyler had ever heard the specific story behind the citation, questions Tyler had been entirely unable to answer, having genuinely never heard any detailed account of what that Silver Star actually represented. I want to tell you honestly what happened in me hearing this account from Marcus, sitting in my own kitchen, because I think it matters. Something that had been quiet for decades opened its eyes, not with pride exactly, but with a kind of tired, unexpected clarity, the specific stillness of a man understanding that a stranger's classroom lesson had just accomplished something I'd never quite found the right moment to accomplish myself. Ms. Alvarez called me that same evening, her voice carrying genuine professional excitement mixed with a kind of careful respect. "Mr. Pierce," she said, "I want to apologize if this feels like an intrusion. I had no idea, when I selected your citation for today's lesson, that I'd actually be teaching about your own grandson's family. I'd be deeply honored if you'd ever consider speaking to the class directly, sharing the actual story behind that citation, if you're willing. I want to describe what happened during that classroom visit, because it's the actual heart of this story, more than the birthday party comment or the coincidence of the lesson itself. I told the class, in careful, measured detail, exactly what that ambush had involved, the specific decisions I'd made under genuinely difficult circumstances, the two men I'd gotten out alive alongside me, one of whom, I mentioned, still calls me every year on the anniversary of that day. After the presentation, as students filed out, Tyler approached me at the front of the classroom, his expression carrying something I hadn't seen from him in longer than I could easily place. "Grandpa," he said, "why didn't you ever tell me any of this? At Jake's party, I said you never did anything important. I said it because I genuinely had no idea. I feel like an idiot. I want to answer that question honestly, the way I answered it that afternoon, because I think it matters more than the citation itself. Because I didn't want you growing up feeling like you had to measure yourself against an old medal," I said. "I wanted you to know me as your grandfather first, the man who fixes things and shows up to your games, not as whatever that citation says about me. That felt like the more important thing to be, Tyler. It still does." The weeks that followed were their own kind of complicated. There's a version of this story where the classroom is the climax and everything after is a footnote, but that's not how these things actually resolve, and I want to be honest about that. Real resolution is slow. It's Tyler calling more often, asking careful, genuine questions about my service, questions that required sitting with answers that didn't resolve neatly into simple, comfortable stories. There was an afternoon, about a month after that classroom visit, when Tyler asked if he could see the actual medal itself, still sitting in its wooden box in my closet. I brought it out and set it on my kitchen table, and he sat looking at it for a long time before he spoke. "Why'd you keep it in a box instead of displaying it somewhere?" he asked. "Because for most of my life, I wasn't sure I wanted to look at it every day," I said. "Some medals come with a weight that doesn't get lighter just because time passes. I earned that star on one of the hardest days of my life, Tyler. It's not something I ever wanted displayed like a trophy." "Ms. Alvarez said the two men you saved are still alive," he said. "Do you still talk to them?" "One of them every year," I said. "The other passed a few years back, but his daughter still sends me a Christmas card. That's part of why I've never needed the medal displayed somewhere prominent. The actual relationships built from that day matter more to me than the citation does." I watched my grandson, in the weeks after that, do something I hadn't fully seen him do before. At a subsequent family gathering, when a cousin asked what his grandfather used to do, Tyler answered, without hesitation, "My grandfather received the Silver Star for saving two men's lives during an ambush." I told my friends at a party a few weeks ago that he never did anything important. That's honestly one of the dumbest things I've ever said, and I'm never going to say something like that again without actually asking first. I didn't feel triumphant when the whole situation finally settled. I want to be honest about that too. I felt tired, the particular tired that comes after finally setting down a story you'd carried quietly, mostly alone, for decades. I thought about Ruth a great deal in those weeks, wondering what she would have made of watching our grandson finally ask the real questions we'd both quietly hoped he'd get around to eventually, watching Tyler learn to sit with a more complete version of the grandfather who'd always simply fixed things and shown up. It's been almost a year now. Tyler visits most weekends now. Genuine visits rather than the obligatory family dinners that characterized much of our relationship before that classroom lesson. Miss Alvarez and I have kept in touch. An unlikely friendship built on a classroom coincidence neither of us expected to develop into something ongoing. I've returned to speak with her subsequent classes twice now, sharing the story on my own terms, always careful to keep the focus on the men who didn't come home from other operations, rather than simply my own actions. Last month, Tyler asked if he could go through some of my other old materials properly, not out of urgent curiosity, but out of genuine interest in knowing his grandfather more completely. He sat with old photographs and letters for a long time. "Why'd you keep all of this hidden for so long?" he asked. "Not just from my friends, from me." "Because I didn't want you to know your grandfather as a soldier first," I said. "I wanted you to know him as your grandfather, the guy who shows up to your games and helps you fix your bike. I still do. The soldier survived something terrible. The grandfather was for making sure you never had to carry the weight of that alongside me." He looked at the old photographs a long moment, then up at me. "You could have been both the whole time," he said. "I just never asked the right questions, and I let the simple version feel like the whole story." I think about that often now. How much of the people we love we simply never fully see, not because they're hiding on purpose, but because we've already decided, quietly and long ago, what shape we expect them to take, or because nobody's ever given us a reason to look past the simple version. Tyler looked at me for 14 years and saw a boring old guy who fixes stuff around the house. He wasn't entirely wrong that I prefer a quiet, unremarkable daily life. He was wrong about nearly everything else.